Fixtures and factories, still in the world of testing. And here's the scenario we're going to look at next. So far, we've said you want to isolate the test from things it depends on. That's always true. And one way to do that is to create either fake methods, method stubs, or fake stunt double objects, in both cases whose behavior we control, and to use those in the test instead of the real thing. But what if there are cases where having the real thing would actually be better in some limited way? For example, suppose we want to have a test that does something like the following. We're going to start out by creating a stunt double of a movie object. And we know that we're going to end up passing that stunt double to something that is going to expect to ask the movie what its title is. OK, well, no big deal. We could just say, allow fake movie to receive the title method. And if it does, return something. Fair enough. But if that same method that we're going to call is also going to ask it for its rating, OK, well, now we have to set up another stub and say, OK, also stub the rating method. And if that gets called, return PG. And if there's also a third method that might get called name with rating, we have to stub that too. And by the time you're done, basically, you've re-implemented everything a movie actually does if you had a real movie. So what do you do in a case like this to keep your test separate from the real thing, but when you actually want an object that has all of the behaviors, not just a stunt double that can do one or two things, but substantially everything? So there's kind of two places you can get a real object. One of them, which you should not use, but I'm going to explain how it works so that when you see it, you're like, you shouldn't use it, is called a fixture. And in a SAS application, basically this means because the application relies on storing all the models in a database, we can put some hardwired objects into that database before the tests run. The test can expect to find the objects there, and those are real objects whose properties we know. So they can use the objects in a predictable way. They know what the name of the movie is because it's always the same one preloaded in the same place in the database every single time. You shouldn't do this for reasons I'll soon explain. The other way is what's called a factory. And those of you who have ever read about design patterns or something, not to be confused with anything having to do with a factory pattern in software. This is a different use of the word factory. A factory is a way to create the objects you need in a way that says, look, create me a movie. I actually don't care what the attributes are, but they need to be actual attributes. They need to exist because somebody might ask for them. Or maybe I want to selectively override certain attributes. But for the most part, I just want an object that behaves in every respect like a movie, but I don't care what the details are. So let's look at each one of these. By the way you can spot something like this is if you see a test. Here's an example that I'm going to give that if you wanted to search for a movie by its director or by the awards it received. So if I had an expectation like movie.award.type, well, this is pretty awkward because if M is a stunt double for a movie, not only do I, and similarly I can say, the name of the director equals, the problem is that now I have to actually double all of the things, right? I need a dummy for the award and the director, and I need to say, on the double movie, return those things. Like, this is a mess, right? This is more code than you should have to read, and it doesn't test anything interesting. Some people call this a mock train wreck, mock being another word for the stunt double object that stands in for the movie. So, when you see this kind of like, boy, I have to call this chain of methods, so I have to basically mock everything along the line, that's a sign that something is wrong with your design. But setting that aside, fixtures and factories, the two ways to get a real object. First way is very simple. You can have a YML file in spec fixtures, and in that file you can have a handful of movies that where you have basically predefined what the attributes will be. And then any test that wants to take advantage of that can just say, I'm going to grab the movie whose label in this file is milk movie, and now I know exactly what the attributes of that movie are. So I can write my test code around the assumption of what these things are. Before I deprecate this, can anybody, or would anybody like to guess why I'm about to deprecate this and say, in general, this is not how you should do it if you need a real movie, and I'm going to show you a better way? What is wrong with doing it this way? Or what is potentially a pitfall of doing it this way? What good property of testing am I breaking?
Well, if you change something about the movie, you have to go back.
Yeah, so one problem is if I change what's in here, all of a sudden I might have a bunch of tests gratuitously failing because they rely on these specific values. And in fact, there's more subtle things, right? Like suppose I add a third one in here because I have some other test that wants to use one. But somewhere I have a test that makes assumptions about the number of movies in the database. all of a sudden that information has now leaked out of my fixtures. So in general, you shouldn't use this to create objects used in your tests. You can use it for things like configuration data, data that is not changed very often and is required for the app to work properly. Example, the time zone in which the user wants to run the app. The app needs that information to function. It probably doesn't matter what value you pick, but the app just won't run, and therefore you can't really have any tests unless you have a value for that. So those are the kinds of things that you might use fixtures for, right? Really static data that is not part of the logic manipulated by the models. If you use fixtures, just like everything else, the database is incinerated and reloaded at the beginning of every test. So you get a degree of independence. But again, if you have tests that depend on specific things about the fixtures, you may be endangering that. So my recommendation was use it for truly static or very, very slowly changing data that the app needs, but that is not really central to any particular test. It's sort of needed for anything at all to happen in the app. And the main reason is you might end up introducing one or more dependencies on the fixture data, and now you've broken tests being independent from each other. So what is a better way to do this? The better way to do this is a factory. And a factory is basically a place where you can provide instructions to say, to create a movie, here's a basic sort of blueprint for doing it. Don't bother me about the details. So there's, compared to fixtures, your tests are a lot more independent because each test only sets up the specific objects that it needs. There's no possibility of random other things being in the database that the test did not expect, and that therefore that might somehow interfere with the test. The one thing to be careful of is that when we talk about associations next week and the ways that models can be related to each other, you might have to set up sort of a complex relationship of things in order for a test to happen. So for example, if I'm working on a social media app and there's a notion of me being part of a graph of friends and I want to test something about the connectivity of that graph, I sort of have to create a little entire graph in order for any test to work. It is still probably in most cases better to factory that than to fixture it. But in many cases, when you find that a test is hard to set up, what it's really telling you is that your code is too tightly coupled. That the fact that you can't test these behaviors sort of in a small space might indicate a design problem. So setting the design problems aside for now, what is it like to use factories instead of fixtures? Well, there's a gem for it. It used to be called Factory Girl. It was renamed Factory Bot a couple of years ago. I am OK with either one. I think Factory Girl refers to the name of a movie that is before my time or something. But basically, here's the way it works. You have a separate set of files where you define your factories. And here's an example factory. Again, don't worry about the syntax. My goal is to help you understand how factories work and how they are used. Here's an example factory for creating movie type objects, right? Objects of the movie class. Basically, it says when you need a movie, I'm going to give it the title, a fake title. I'm going to give it this rating, and I'm going to say that it was released 10 years ago relative to whenever the test runs. That may or may not be a good choice for your application. But basically, this is a way of saying, create me a movie when I don't care too much about the details. In my test, when I need a movie object that has all the behaviors that a movie has, I can say build to create an object in memory but not put it into the database. Or instead of build, I can say create. That actually creates the object and sticks it in the database so that now I can use active record find on it if that's what I want to do. I can selectively, as I did here, I can selectively override certain attributes of the object. So here I'm saying, I want a movie, and I definitely want the title to be Milk, but I don't care about the other stuff. So this is pretty convenient, because the thing you're going to get back is a real flesh and blood movie object. It's a member of the movie class. It responds to everything a movie responds to. It even lives in the database if you said create rather than build. But it's temporary. After this test is over, it gets blown away. And in the meantime, you can do everything to it that you would do to a regular movie object, right? And again, you'll find that this is useful when, if you have a test that isn't really about movies, it's about something else, but it needs to consume a movie object just to get the code running. That's a case where you say, just give me a movie. Any movie will do. Make one for me on the fly. And that's when factories really help you out. Okay, so they're quite simple to set up. Now, you might say, well, Active Record has a way of just doing things like new and create, right? The way that we would have code in our app to create new versions of that model, why can't we just use that? And essentially, that's what Factory Bot does. It just pulls the code out of the main line of your testing, rather than having your test have to worry about the movie attributes it doesn't care about, we've hidden that stuff somewhere else. And as you'll see when we talk about associations starting next week, in the event that movies have connections to other things, like reviews or moviegoers who saw it or tickets or anything like that, FactoryBot provides a really nice way to set up those relationships transparently. So your test code doesn't really get polluted with the details of building a movie. It's enough for it basically to say, I want a movie and I want this to be its title. I don't care about anything else, right? So it lets the test code itself be pretty narrowly focused.